And we come today to the 17th chapter of Acts, beginning in verse 19, although the section actually began in verse 16, so we'll just briefly go over 16, 17, and 18 again that we looked at last week in our continuing verse-by-verse study of the book of Acts. And Paul is on his second missionary journey. He had been in Thessalonica and basically got kicked out of Thessalonica, so he went to Berea. Things were going well in Berea until the people from Thessalonica caught up with him, and so he snuck out. Exactly how or what route we don't know, but he snuck out, left Silas and Timothy behind, and he comes then to Athens, and we find him in Athens. In verse 16, it says, "Now when Paul waited for them in Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. Therefore disputed he in the synagogue with the Jews and with the devout persons and with the market daily with them that met with him. Then certain philosophers of the Epicureans and of the Stoics encountered him, and some said, 'What will this babbler say?' Others, some, he seemeth to be a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection." Now, that was last week. We're going to see, by the way, just barely going to get up to it, that the resurrection really is going to become the key issue with both the Epicureans and the Stoics. The Epicureans, the Stoics, and I would really add one more group, and I'll just call them the Athenians. There were, obviously, Epicureans were Athenians and Stoics were Athenians, but then there were just Athenians. They weren't necessarily into the philosophy of the Epicureans or the philosophy of the Stoics, but they just happened to live there, and they would live and move and have their being in Athens, and they would go to the marketplace and hear these things going on. So you kind of got three groups of people. But it's the Epicureans and the Stoics who we want to talk bad about, but I'm going to give them a little bit of hero status here, that at least they say, here's something interesting, we ought to talk about it. And they arrange the meeting, if you will, at Mars Hill and say, hey, Paul, Babylon. I don't know that we can put where it says, what does this babbler say? The word babbler there does give the idea, both in the Greek and the English, does give the idea that they don't think he's got much substance to him, but at least they're going to give him the opportunity to babble. And I might say in the Christian world that sometimes we so much already know the answer that we won't listen to anyone else give another argument. And that is a dangerous place, I think, to be. Now, I don't want us to be, as we've said before, so open-minded that your brains fall out, but we ought to be able to hear a message, hear an argument, hear something going on, and analyze it and reject it later. But let's at least let them babble on a little bit and try to interact with the discussion. I've mentioned a number of times, even things like Schofield's gap theory, and I obviously, as you know, use a Scofield Bible, and he holds to the gap theory, and I don't hold to the gap theory. But I also think that the person who won't even listen to Scofield express his gap theory really has no idea what Schofield's gap theory is. And what you'd find out is he's got a lot more substance than you thought he had at the beginning. And you can't just be utterly dismissive of it. You can analyze it and say, right here is where I think he went off, and this is why I reject his final conclusions that he comes up with. Now, I think that's the point of intellectual maturity. How's that? So the Epicureans and the Stoics were at least intellectually mature enough to say, let's hear the guy out. And so they come. Now, I went just briefly last week again into the philosophies of Epicureans and Stoics, and I am not an expert on this, and so if I talked too long, I would have to make things up. which I am a pastor, so I'm skilled at doing. But the Epicurean, if you could encapsulize the Epicurean philosophy, it is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. It's possible. And yet that sounds, I think, way too negative for where Epicureans actually were. Epicurean, maybe if I can put it this way, an Epicurean said, I can't necessarily control everything, so I just as well live my life and go out to lunch. And tomorrow may bring disaster, but today I'm going to enjoy life. That was an Epicurean philosophy. I would suspect that maybe some of you lean Epicurean, since you happen to be here this morning. But then there are the Stoics. You may lean Stoic as well, because the Stoics would not appreciate the smiles of the Epicureans, the joy of the Epicureans. The Stoics said, I must be in control of all my heart, my emotions, my grief, my anger, my joy, whatever it is. I have got to be cool, calm, and collected. And so they, in one essence, they were both ending up in the same place, that they both continued to put one foot in front of another and move on. One said, there's nothing we can do about it, let's keep moving. And the other said, there's nothing we can do about it, let's go to lunch. So it was definitely two different philosophies, but in one sense they were kind of related here. So strange bedfellows, maybe a little bit, but again, they did have that ultimate idea that there were powers in charge that they could not influence. And the powers for them, I might put a capital P on it, though certainly, obviously not Christian, but they believed in deity powers. Now, the Epicureans were deists. There is a power out there that we can't know or understand or influence, but he's in charge. The Stoics were more pantheists, that God is within everything, or deity, power is within everything, energy is within everything, but all we can do is recognize that. We still can't influence that in any way. And on both cases, whether it's a God way up there who really doesn't care, or it's a God within us and through us and around us and all that, it is something that is out of our control, and it is what it is, so let's move on. So moving on, we have these two groups of people. Some say, what will this babbler say? Others, he is a setter forth of strange gods, because he preached unto them Jesus and the resurrection. But verse 19 is where I want us to pick up. They took him and brought him unto Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new doctrine whereof thou speakest of. Okay, tell us about it, basically, is that. Verse 20, for thou bringest certain strange things to our ears. We would know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, again, wouldn't you agree with me that if you were Paul, you would take that as a welcome sign? We want to know what these things mean. And that is, I think, in Paul's mind, that is saying, hey, I've got an open door. This is a wonderful thing. I am going to take advantage of it. I'm going to smile and move forward. And this is exactly, again, what he comes. So they want to know more about this new doctrine. A doctrine is a set of beliefs altogether. So what is your set of beliefs that you have? They want to know about it. So they come to Areopagus. Down in verse 22, it says, then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill. Mars Hill is the translation of the Greek word Areopagus. So the King James translators here have in one place decided to transliterate it, Areopagus, and in another place they decided to translate it Mars Hill. Ares is Mars. And the Apagus, it's the gathering place, the hill, actually, the Apagus. I should know better. David, do you know what that means?
No, I don't. But do you look down from the?
Yeah, you do. It's not the high point.
Not the high point, it's not
Acropolis.
the Acropolis, right?
That's right.
Nobody pointed it out to me. But could you see it from there?
You could, and that's where we got stuck in the rainstorm, and so we didn't actually end up there. But the Acropolis was the temple of Athena, from which Athens gains its name. And it's everyone has seen the Acropolis in their mind in pictures, and they don't go there, though that was certainly there in that day. And just down from there is Mars Hill. So it's kind of interesting that you look down upon Mars Hill, but you do. And I have been there one other time, and it's a very kind of a rocky, craggly place. I don't know that all of you will know this, but there's a place when you go up north on I-25 through Colorado, there's a pulpit rock. And if you envision really big, it looks like a pulpit from which a giant god would stand and preach. There's kind of that rock formation there. It's almost a natural place for people to gather, and it was also the location more of the marketplace, so a lot of people coming and going. If we could put it in modern day Taos terms, it's the plaza, and they gather down at the plaza, and there's a gazebo there for him to speak from, and a microphone, and so he goes and he begins to do this work. So Mars Hill Areopagus. He has not been accused of anything, and they're not in Athens. He will be on trial, but he's never in trial in Athens. And I hope I'm right as I carry that out. Let's question that assumption and watch through. But so he is. Yeah, he's not on trial. He's given an opportunity to share, to express his feelings, his beliefs, and that is exactly what he's going to do on Mars Hill, or Acropolis, which is the same place. And so again, basically, we ought to thank the Epicureans and the Stoics for arranging the meeting. They have done this. And verse 21 then says, for all the Athenians and strangers which were there spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or to hear some new thing. Now, this is a parenthetical statement, and sort of the narrator comes in and gives this parenthetical statement. And I think we show a little bit of a, we've got to come out of this thing with a balance. Here we've got Epicureans and Stoics who say, we want to hear this new thing. And then we're parenthetically given this idea that there are the Athenians and the strangers. I think what that means is Athens was known for, and people traveled from all around to Athens in order to hear something new. And I think that what we ought to point out is that can kind of become an addiction, if you will, that I've always got to have something new. And I take this, and I suppose you could take this in two ways, but I take this to say the Athenians just always wanted to circle around and around a truth but never land on a truth. They were always eager to hear the next new thing. Again, the Epicureans and Stoics kind of have that. Hey, we want to hear this new doctrine. And Robin's pointing to Taos. Taos kind of has that. Hey, you know what's... And you can get caught up in sort of this drug of a new thing. And I think that there does come a time when you have to weigh the evidence, you have to look at it, and you have to decide, is he an idle babbler, or does he actually have some substance to it? What am I going to do with this message? And there are so many messages available to us today. You heard of this thing called YouTube, right? So many messages available to us today that somewhere I think you and I do have to build some kind of parameters to say, this is what I'm going to use to determine whether or not I'm going to follow the path all the way down. Because with coronavirus, you're probably not going to live long enough to actually to discern and determine all of the truth that is out there. We're going to die someday. And so how in the world are we ever going to study all these things? So we've got to, somewhere in our lives, build some parameters. So, for example, using the Epicureans or the Stoics here, one of the parameters that I have built is that I'm not a deist. I happen to think that God has an identity and he interacts in our world today. So I don't have to follow every idea of deism, though it might be, there might be some curiosity and I might learn some things and pick up a few things, but I'm not a deist, so I'm not a pantheist. So I can put aside the pantheist ideas and say, I don't have time to study everything, and I'm not really studying deism, and I'm not really studying pantheism. I'm studying theism, if you will, that there is a God who's identifiable. His name's Theo. That's theism. There's an identifiable God. I'm in there. So here, I take it as a negative statement in verse 21 that the Athenians were strangers. They spent their time in nothing else but either to tell or hear something new. So what I want to be is principled rather than endlessly curious. And I say all of that. I love curiosity. I love skepticism. I love someone who will look under that rock and see what is there and open that door and check it out and entertain an argument as you have with the Epicureans and the Stoics. So somewhere in there, I think we got to find this balance. Had they not wanted to hear something new, Paul never would have had an opportunity to speak his new message here. And so I applaud them for that. But I heard someone the other day tell me, they were talking about this, maybe it was Corey and I were talking, how someone called Paul's experience in Athens Paul's greatest failure. And we were presuming that they called it that because, as far as we can tell, there never was a church at Athens, like the church at Corinth down the road or the church at Ephesus over across the sea. Why isn't there a church at Athens in the letter to the church at Athens? And you just don't hear about it anymore. And so somebody used the words, it's Paul's greatest failure. So maybe we should not put the blame on the preacher, of course. Maybe here it's the congregation that they love to hear new things, but they get bored with that pretty quick and they're ready to move on and hear another thing, and they're never really going to settle on any kind of truth. That, I suppose with the entertainment world, we love to hear new things. What's new at the movies, what's new on the radio, whatever it might be. And our ears itch to hear something new. And yet, imagine if we just rejected everything that was old in our life and culture and did away with that. Obviously, there needs to be some kind of a balance that comes here. Now, let's get into his message, beginning in verse 22. Where says, Then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, Ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. For I passed by and beheld your devotions, and I found an altar with the inscription, To the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. Okay. That's his introduction. In one sense, that's a pretty strongly negative introduction. If I'm your guest preacher for today and I come in and say, y'all are too superstitious, let me tell you about the ignorant things that you're doing. It's a great way to start a sermon, right? I used to read it that way. Looking into it a little more closely now, I'm not so sure that this is quite as negative as it comes off in English. And once again, I've said 10,000 times, it's so hard to pick emotion and the spirit of the things just from the printed word. But let's dig into this a little bit and see. First of all, he says, I perceive. The word there is theoreo. Theoreo, of course, we get our word theory. So it's almost like he says, hey, folks, I have a theory. Let's test out this theory. What do you think about this theory? I think you're too superstitious. That's my theory. Now, even the way I said that, even using the term superstitious, that is not quite as negative as you people are too superstitious. It is, I have a theory. Let's check it out. But I perceive, or theoreo, and here's my perception or my theory. Let's see if it's correct or not. He says then again that you are too superstitious. Now, that, of course, has I would say, a negative tone in the English language. Superstition, I don't know if you could ever use it in the English language in a manner in which that would be well received. We do not value a person being superstitious. He should not worry about walking under the ladder. That's too superstitious. We would use it in a negative way. So the word is a $2 word here in Greek. Desidaimon. Desidaimon. Now, let's start with the end of that, which is daimon. Daimon is the Greek word from which we get demon. Desidaimon. So there's demon in there. Now, the danger of looking at how a word was built, etymology, is that you can assume what our English word means, built on that, is what the word meant then. It's not necessarily true. So daimon for us is demon. That is always, let's say, an evil spirit. Daimon for them was not necessarily an evil spirit, but it certainly was the spiritual, and let's just say spirits. And then that desi is a word for reverence or fear, but fear in the sense that we might say, fear God. So we'll call it reverence. So literally a reverence for demons, but since they didn't necessarily have the negative tone of demons that we do, let's say a reverence for spirits. So if you spin that positive, which is what I'm working on doing here, if you spin it positive, then in the spin room, what do you have? I have a theory. You all have a reverence for the spiritual. Now, I think that probably is closer to what Paul said than you country bumpkin idiots. You're so superstitious. I think he's saying you have a desidaimon. You have a reverence for the spiritual. And okay, yeah, the ESV and I think the New American Standard also says you're too religious, or how's it put it? You're very religious, or religious in all respects. Okay, so I think that, and I meant to, and I didn't do it, by the way, I meant to go back to the Oxford English Dictionary, which is kind of the authority on the English language, and see what superstitious meant in 1611, because very often I find that in the 400 years since, we have turned a word negative that wasn't even negative in 1611. So did the King James writers make it superstitiously negative, or is that just where we are in the year 2020? Pardon me that I got sidetracked and I didn't go back and do that. But yeah, you're very religious in all respects. You have this reverence for the spiritual. Now, wouldn't you say, let's just take Taos, New Mexico, wouldn't you say that Taos, New Mexico is very religious in all respects? And you could give that a very negative sense that we often do, or you could give it a very positive sense that sometimes people do. I do think, by the way, it is one of the open doors that we can use in Taos, New Mexico, is that we do not live in a place that rejects the idea of the spiritual. It is a place that actually embraces the idea of the spiritual. And so we can come and say, let's have a spiritual discussion. And people are open to a spiritual discussion. Now, sometimes you add some specifics to the spiritual discussion. They may not be open to that necessarily, but that's going to be true for Paul as well. That's a little bit of the human nature. His discussion is not going to be well received in the end, because he's going to bring up the resurrection, and they're very reverent towards the spirituality, but they did reject the resurrection, and so that was they weren't willing to go there. They had a certain open door, but not too far. This is such a balance, isn't it, in trying to figure out how in the world do you share your faith with someone who's very religious but completely different in their spirituality, in their worldview. And so Paul is making he's going to take this, but here you are, you're respective of the spirit world. That's my theory. You all are respective of the spirit world, it seems like. And I might say here also that, again, I'm not an expert in Greek mythology, but in Greek mythology, you had gods, you had the spiritual world. You didn't necessarily have the good versus the evil. There was a lot of, we look at, some of them like Medusa or whatever, and there's that evil connotation to us. But in the Greek world, it was much more of a balance, and this is the role that she or he plays, and this is the role. And it was, I think we have a hard time completely understanding it because of our Christian worldview of evil spirits and good spirits, angels and demons. And we bring so much already packed into our bag on this. But here we come, and he continues then with that theory, and he says, "For I passed by and beheld your devotions," that is, you're very religious in all respects, "and I found an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you.'" Now, once again, we can put a very negative spin on this. You ignorantly worship this God. Let me tell you who he is. Or we can say, you are very devoted to the spirit world. You have recognized in your own spirituality that you don't even know all of the gods that are out there. I would like to tell you about one that you don't know about. And that is what he's going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and put a positive spin on this. In the past, when I've looked at this, I just took the English and I took a negative spin on it. I think when you look at the whole thing, he's making a door of opportunity here. And he is coming in and saying, okay, here, what you ignorantly worship. Again, in the English language, to be ignorant is always a negative thing. I assume it was in 1611. I'm not sure. Again, I didn't look that up. But the word in Greek is agnoia. Agnoia. That's the gnosis word, knowledge, with the letter A in front of it. That is, you don't have knowledge of this, which is what ignorance is. It's the lack of knowledge. But again, I don't know that any of you today want to be called ignorant, right? It implies some more in the English language than I think agnoia does. And so he simply comes and says, what you worship without knowledge, I would like to give some knowledge to. Now, if we take this positive spin that I've given on it, then at this point it seems like they would be rather open to hearing his message. Yeah, you're right. We're very spiritual. Yeah, you're right. We have said there's a God that we don't know about. And yeah, if you think you know about him, we would like to know. I mean, we have enough knowledge to know that we don't know this God. So why in the world would we reject the information about this God? We want to know. And so if that's the case, Paul has been very masterful in bringing this about. And so we pick up then in his message in verses 24 and 25, which I'm calling part one of his sermon. And he introduces God as the Almighty Creator. Verse 24 says, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of the heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. Okay, really about three things that are said of God here. And one is he made the world and all things therein. That would most likely have offended the Stoics, who were pantheists, and so they didn't have a creator God. Pantheism is hard to describe, but I would say it's more of a force that is out there. And so here this God with a pronoun, who was the one who created, probably wasn't a welcome idea among the Stoics, but he presents this unknown God anyway as the one who made the world and all that was therein. He says he's Lord of the heaven and earth. That really kind of goes against the deistic idea of God who is absentee. Because if you're Lord of something, you're watching over it. You're caring for it. You're working in it. You're doing it. Again, certainly he's losing his crowd quick, I guess is what I'm saying, as he begins to introduce the identity of this God. And that is one thing that I might add, is that we do find a lot of spiritual people that as soon as you put some specifics on the spirituality, then they're not into that anymore. And so they want kind of a very loose spirituality that doesn't have any doctrinal standards to it. Then he says this is a God who dwelleth not in temples. Well, just the general man on the street in Athens, Athens was so characterized by the temples, and of course you would have had at Mars Hill, behind Paul, would have been the Acropolis, the Temple of Athena. And they would have, it's a slam against your very backdrop there, that God doesn't dwell in temples. Now, to be fair, I don't think the Athenians believed that Athena dwelt in that temple. It was a temple for her, honoring her, worshiping her, sacrificing to her, all of the things that might be involved in worship. But they believed she dwelt, I don't know, Mount Olympus, or I don't know all my Greek mythology where Athena dwelt exactly. But Zeus was on Olympus and Poseidon was in the sea, and all those kind of things is where they actually dwelt. It's an easy slip when you've got temples all around you, as they did in that part of the world, to see that as the dwelling place there of God. Yes, and it's interesting because in other places, Paul is going to speak directly to the Jews on that very issue that he is addressing here, that, hey, God doesn't dwell in temples. Even the one in Jerusalem, he doesn't dwell in. Though I might add one little bit, that there was a time when God's visible glory was in the temple, and the Shekinah glory is the Hebrew word that is used there. So there's that one slight, but he hadn't been there for a long time at this point. So he is a God. He reveals this unknown God here as a God who, in verse 25, is not worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. And it's interesting that the word worship here is not the typical word for worship. The typical word for worship, which is used all over the Scripture, is the proskuneo is actually the I'm not sure if I got that pronounced right, but is the word that is typically used, and it has to be it actually has the word dog in it, that you come like a dog to the master is the picture of the typical word. Now, this word here is actually, did I put the word on here? Yeah, there it is, therapeuo. Therapeuo. We, of course, understand therapy. It's a very Greek word, comes from Serapis, which was, who had a sister named Hygeia. Therapy, hygiene, yes. Asclepius, I think, was their dad. And even today, we don't see it so much anymore in modern days, but you did a generation ago see it all the time. At the pharmacy, the snake going up the vial, that was Serapis, as she would go up, stir the waters, and bring healing. That ties into John 11 at the Pool of Bethesda. The waters are stirred, and I'm not able to come in. All of that's beyond the scope of this lesson here today. We'll save it for another day. But nonetheless, he uses that therapy word, and if I can very, very loosely translate it even to a paraphrase, I would take verse 25 again and say, God does not need your massage. That's the word for, he doesn't need your therapy. And it's a therapeuo was something, and he mentions hands here, worship with men's hands. And so he's bigger than us, I suppose. He's the one who giveth life and breath and all things. And, I think, and again, I'm not sure it's a fair assessment, but we think of the things, the physical things that you might bring to an altar and leave them there, whether it's food or coins or whatever. And Paul is attempting to remove it from that and say, this is not how we worship God. He doesn't need our quarter. He doesn't need our banana. He doesn't need whatever it is. He doesn't need a massage from us, because he is the one who is the giver of all life and breath and all things. So with that little introduction of God, let me say one more thing before I go on to the introduction of God. It would be easy and tempting for a guy like me to stop on these roughly 3 or 4 things that are given in those 2 verses and move off into a complete unit about God who is maker of all things and spend weeks studying his introduction here of the way he introduced God. I'm not so sure that Paul intended that much. It was his introduction, and he was, in a sense, coming, and he's saying, let me tell you about God. My belief in God is he made the world. He's the Lord of all things. He doesn't dwell in temples. He's not worshipped with hands, doesn't need anything. He's the giver of life. That's the God I'm presenting to you. And now let's go into what is more the heart of the message. So it is introductory, if you will. But it lays down some of his presuppositions. Then he comes into verses 26 through 28, which I'm calling part 2 of his sermon, and this is God's activity with mankind. So there's God. I've introduced who he is, but how does he work with us? Verse 26, and God hath made of one blood all the nations of men for to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation, that they should seek the Lord, if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. And certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Now, let's back up and pull that apart just a little bit. So God made of one blood all nations of men. What he's saying there, I think, is fairly obvious when you think about it. What he's saying is God started with Adam, and from one blood he made all men, that we all proceed forth from Adam, if you will. And that does deny any kind of evolutionary model in what he's saying here, that God made from all. From one blood, all nations of men. It also reminds us that though we are different ethnos, nations, we are one race. There's just the human race, and there happens to be various ethnicities within the human race, the various nations. So here it uses the term blood and the term nations. We're one blood, we're one nations. Now, the modern versions, by the way, don't have the word blood. They leave that out. They just say made of one, I believe. And probably insert a word. Is that right, Robin? In verse 20, what is that, 26? Made of one man. And is man italicized? It is in New American Standard, not in ESV, because ESV just says, trust me. You don't need to know when we inserted something. We're totally trustworthy. But I'm too much of a skeptic to go for that. So man is inserted. And it's because something has made of one what? Well, the text underlying the King James has the word blood. The text underlying the modern versions do not. But the point is clear either way. He made of one, that is Adam, all the ethnos of men for to dwell on the face of the earth. Now, furthermore, he determined the times before appointed. Determined, I like the word there, it's horizo, and it's the word from which we get horizon. That is, you can see how far. You can see to the horizon. Can't really see beyond the horizon. You can see to the horizon. So determined, the word there is almost always horizo, and it is that word to say there's a boundary. This is as far as it goes. This is the outer boundary of it all. So he has determined the times before appointed. He's given them the horizon. And he's speaking again of the nations here. So of these nations, he hath determined their times before appointed and the bounds of their habitations. You could get into some very interesting stuff, say with Genesis chapter 11, which is Genesis chapter 10, which is the table of nations, and how the habitation is set for this nation and that nation, and for the descendants of Jephthah and of Shem and of Ham, and all of that. Again, that's more than Paul is going into here. But there is some to back it up. And furthermore, the prophet Daniel talks about the times of the Gentiles. And Paul speaks about it in the book of Romans. He says there will come a time when the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. That is to say that there's this era of the Gentiles, but it's been determined in advance how long that era is going to be. It's not always going to be the times of the Gentiles. At some point, it's going to be the times of the Jews. Now, once again, he's not, that's just behind the scenes on what he's saying here. But God has given this boundary here for the nations and for the peoples. And then what becomes most important is that God has done these things, that is, made all the nations and given them their determined times before appointed. He's done that so that in verse 27, they should seek the Lord. Well, that's the purpose right here. So that they should seek the Lord. So the purpose of all nations is to seek the Lord. They come from one. They were made by him. They should seek the Lord. It says, I'll read again the King James 27, that is, he did those things, that they should seek the Lord, if haply, Haply, what's that? Circumstantially, happenstance, they might feel after him. Catch the picture that's given there. We might use the word grope. groping in the darkness. That's sort of the word there is, hey, the nations are out there like you Athenians, and you're sort of in the dark out there feeling after him. And guess what? This is a good thing. Keep on feeling, because if haply they might feel after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. What he's saying is, if you'll look for him, you'll find him. There's an unknown God. Don't stop with just recognition that there's an unknown God. Let's figure out who the unknown God is. It almost demands, if you have a temple to an unknown God or an altar to an unknown God. And by the way, I skipped that, but it is an altar to an unknown God. So you make sacrifices on an altar, whether it's a financial sacrifice or a blood sacrifice, whatever, we don't know. But they were making sacrifices to an unknown God. If you're going to go to that extent, at least figure out who he is, right? This is what Paul's saying. So maybe circumstantially, you Athenians come and you are feeling for him. That's a good thing, because guess what? You might find him. Because he be not far from every one of us. Search for me and you will find me, is what God said to the Jewish people in the book of Jeremiah. And he's not far, so the first thing you got to do is start looking. Verse 25, for in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. I find that so interesting that he quotes one of the Athenian poets. We also are his offspring. And that tells me that that Paul was well educated in a cosmopolitan way. Is that the word that I'm looking for? He was not just well educated in his own Jewish ways, but he was well educated in the history of the world and the worldviews that were out there and all the things. He was a Renaissance man. He just knew everything, including some of the poetry that was out there. It seems to be a rather common poetic line. I've been, for some reason, the last several days, I've been thinking of those words of Kipling: if you can keep your head while all about you men are losing theirs. I don't know why that has come to mind the last several days, but nonetheless, I think that one of the things we ought to value in modern life and we don't value in modern life is a solid base of knowledge. That used to be education. In fact, liberal arts was that. You went to get a liberal art degree and you knew the maths, you knew the math and sciences and the histories and the literature and all these kind of things. And knowing all of that stuff, you were liberated. You were liberated from provincial thinking, from small thinking, all these kind of things by that vast degree of knowledge. Unfortunately, I think we've kind of lost that idea, that value of liberal education, because it has become progressive, agenda-driven education rather than just the knowledge of all this stuff. But Paul seemed to have a degree in liberal arts, and he was able to quote the poet. The poet actually is Aratus, and the poem is Phenomena. I have not read the whole poem. I'm looking for an English copy to read, and I found bits and pieces. But it actually, from what I read about it, it was a fairly inaccurate, scientifically, explanation of the constellations. But it was inaccurate for the knowledge of the time. It was not inaccurate because the author was ignorant. He and others around him knew the science of the day, and there's plenty of material to see that. But it wasn't designed to scientifically tell you about the constellations. It was designed to give you an understanding of the sky above you so that you would be able to look at it. For example, what is it? Red sky, dawn, rough sailing on, smooth sailing on, red sky, dusk. Get under the covers. As you see, I don't know all that, but that's not a scientific kind of thing. It's a general. So it was this way for the society to learn the zodiac. Basically, is what it was. kind of a poem like that. For some reason, I want to think of the fork ran away with the spoon and the cow jumped over the moon. But it was a poem to help them with that. Now, there is the line, and I've given it to you here. It says, "Let us begin with God, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of God. For the sea and the harbor are full of this deity. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to God, for we indeed are his offspring." And that's the line that Paul quotes there. We indeed are his offspring. So he's going from their understanding, there is God, God is close by, we are his offspring. And Paul just takes it one step further and says, now let's figure out who he is. Now let's put some identity to this God. Let's see if we can get to know this God. And we will pick up at verse 29 next time. I'm already well past time here today. So let me lead us in a word of prayer, and we'll take a little break before we have our worship service. Heavenly Father, thank you for the very interesting record we have of Paul's ministry in Athens. And we pray that we would be men and women who have open minds, but minds that are driven by the truths that now are given to us in the full revelation of Scripture, for which we're grateful to have. In Jesus' name, amen.